Hello everyone, and thank you for coming to listen my presentation on the so-called Nordic model. So this Nordic model is a feminist-inspired prostitution and anti-trafficking policy that has in recent years taken a central stage in global discussions around commercial sex and its regulation. And it's a feminist-inspired policy model in a sense that it understands commercial sex as a form of violence against women, and it aims to abolish commercial sex by criminalising the buying but not the selling of sex in the name of gender equality and protecting women in the sex trade. And like I said, it has been globally successful. In this presentation, I will, however, unpack the policy approaches, humanitarian claims, through ethnographic research and argue that the Nordic model functions rather as a punitive form of humanitarianism governing in the name of caring. So first I wanted to say a few things about the Nordic model, the so-called Nordic model approach. So this approach originates in a Nordic welfare state, Sweden, that in 1999 was the first country to criminalize the buying rather than the selling of sex, relying on feminist arguments. The reasoning behind the law is that without buyers, the so-called demand, there wouldn't be no sex industry or trafficking. And because women in this policy model or in this approach are seen as victims, they should not be further punished, but instead protected. And what makes this Nordic model or end-demand approach so current at the moment is that in an environment of heightened sensationalism and concerns over sex trafficking, this policy model has become the center of international trafficking and prostitution policy debates. And in the 2010s, countries such as Canada, France, Ireland and Israel have adopted the model. Also, many feminist organizations push this as a kind of a humanitarian and feminist solution to the problems in the sex trade. Here you can see some flyers from the UK-based Nordic model now. Also, many anti-trafficking organizations all over the world promote it as a solution to the problems of the sex trade. And this is, for example, in the US Demand and End Kansas branch. So the debates around this policy are taking place all over the world, in Europe, in Spain and Germany, in Australia, Latin America, and the USA, for example. And for example, here you can see New Yorkers for the Equality model that promotes a Nordic model style policy in the New York State. In the US, also in Washington, D.C. and Louisiana, we see similar political debates taking place. However, despite this increase in popularity, there is little rigorous academic research on the consequences of the model, especially to people who sell sex. And if we think about the majority of the people nowadays in many places are migrants, there is no research on how this policy intersects with immigration controls and affects migrant workers. Therefore, in this research, I try to respond to this need of research and provide an account of the Nordic model approach and its intersections with governance of migration. And in my research, I ask, what does it mean that sex work is increasingly governed through feminist arguments of protection and care? And who is most affected by this policy and with what consequences? Before I go to my findings, I thought I'd say a few words about my fieldwork and the research that I'm basing this presentation on. So for this study, I did a multi-sided ethnography in Sweden, Norway and Finland, in the region where this policy originates. And during my fieldwork, I did participant observations at places where sex is sold and also at service provisions where sex workers gather. In addition to these participant observations and field discussions, I did 210 formal interviews, out of which majority are with migrant sex workers, but also with state officials, the police, healthcare providers, and social workers. So think about the field of commercial sex in the Nordic region, and this is kind of also reflecting kind of global trends in sex work. So sex work is mostly sold online and indoors since the 1990s, when kind of internet became prominent. Also, in many places, migrants form the majority of sex workers. And in Europe, in general, it's from 60 to 90%. In the Nordic region, the estimates are that upwards 70% of the sex workers are migrants. And the migrants are usually highly mobile, so they don't reside permanently in the Nordic region. They usually travel from their place of residence, whether it's Romania or Russia, or for example, Spain for Nigerians, and come for short periods of time to do sex work in the north. And what makes this cross-border sex work tempting is that the prices in the Nordic region are relatively high, and you can reach income levels that are hard to reach without higher education or language skills. So, for example, if we think about in Romania, the average take-home salary is around 700 euros, and it's an amount that a skilled sex worker can do in a couple of hours in the Nordic region. And I read this quote from this Romanian street worker who I met in Norway, who said that, "I'm not crazy about money. I want what is best for my children, a normal life, chocolate, toys, normal things. But if I do normal work in my home country, I cannot live a normal life. You understand, this is my life experience. In my home country, the system is corrupted. I could, for example, work in a bakery. The salary is 300 euros. How can I support 2 children with that? But money isn't everything. On the street, you can die any minute. I'm returning to Romania because I have 2 children. I'm turning 28 soon. I own a house. I bought land and built it. I paid it with this work. I have also saved money, not much, but enough so that I can open some business, so that I can live normal life in my home country. I'm tired of this stress." So Sarina, when I met her the last time, she was talking that she's returning to home for good, and she had been able to kind of allow kind of social advancement to her and her family. She had been able to purchase a house and also save money to open a business in her home country. So I wanted to say a few things about trafficking, because usually when I talk about migration and sex work with people who are not familiar with topic, they think about trafficking as the first thing. And it's no wonder, because sensationalized images, like the ones you can see in the slide, dominate the media headlines on commercial sex. So there's this overemphasis on trafficking when we talk about commercial sex, and these kind of sensationalized images of exploitation and violence. However, my research shows that there's a great discrepancy between this kind of media and public discourse of sex trafficking and the realities of sex workers and people in the sex trade. For majority, sex work does not coincide with sexual exploitation and trafficking. Like in my study, 6% of the interviewees said that they were trafficked or forced originally to sex work. And this study is pretty much in line with international studies from India, UK and Europe, where estimates are from 6 to 12% of people feel originally forced or trafficked into the sex trade. This of course does not mean that there wouldn't be exploitation or difficult conditions in sex work, or people wouldn't do sex work due to, for example, economic conditions and so on. But the trafficking discourse is too narrow to understand what's going on in commercial sex. So therefore, I argue that there is a need to challenge this victimizing perspective of trafficking and understand both sex work and migration as form of economic agency and economic survival. For many migrant sex workers that I met, the lack of opportunities they face at home motivates their migratory projects. Moreover, my research shows that sex work is often a temporary strategy, a project to advance one's life, for example, to educate children, to finish your own studies, or build a house and start a new life, like in Sorina's case. So people don't stay in sex work forever. It's like more like a temporary strategy. So another thing that is problematic about the trafficking discourse is that in addition to conflating sex work with crime and exploitation, it also individualizes the problem of exploitation to sex buyers or traffickers. And what I saw in my research was that the problems that the people faced in sex work were more related to the institutional structures of immigration and prostitution policies that prevented them to claim their rights and put them in the position of vulnerability. And I will explain this with my findings and, for example, like thinking about the Nordic model and how we need to look kind of beyond the public face of the sex buying to understand how the framework actually works in practice. I will now go to my fieldwork findings. I met Niina, a Latin American trans woman in her 30s, in Oslo in January 2017. Niina, who was based in Spain, had been traveling all around Europe, working through online escort sites for about 10 years. And lately she's been mainly working in Norway and Sweden because she said that the money was better and the clients are good. And when I asked her about how it is to work in the Nordic region, she gave the following assessment of the contradictions within the Nordic model. This is a contradictory law. They kind of let you work, but they control you. In the end, they force you not to work. They say you can work, but you cannot work in an apartment because then the owner is a criminal. You cannot work in a hotel because then the hotel is criminal. Here you cannot call the police if you're in trouble. If somebody is violent, robbing you or something, maybe if you're foreign, the police will put you out of the country. They say that this law is for the women, but it isn't. So Niina gives a very kind of like in this interview, she gives a very good assessment and summary of my fieldwork findings. So despite the explicit aim of the Nordic model to shift attention away from sex workers or women, they are still the main target of policing. So what happens is that the police use client investigations together with anti-trafficking measures to enter the apartments where women are working. And when they visit the apartment, they often also inform the landlord or the hotel that if they do not kick the person out, they will be accused of pimping. So in other words, these client investigations are forced through sex workers and often lead to evictions. And to understand how these investigations lead to evictions, forced evictions of sex workers, we need to look at the so-called pimping law, so the third-party law. And it is very broad in the Nordic region. So all kind of assistance of sex sale is punishable, even if you don't get any profit or anything from it. So this means that regular landlords or hotel owners can be accused of pimping if they rent apartment to a sex worker. So what this does is that it practically criminalizes the places of work for sex workers, and the police has also taken this as a tool to kind of clean the market of sex workers. They don't have to do anything, they just call the landlord or inform the hotel and they get rid of the sex workers without any kind of like real procedures. So in addition to these evictions, in my research, I found that the police targets especially migrants and uses racialized and ethnic profiling when performing client and anti-trafficking investigation. And they showed me when they were looking at the advertisement that they look especially for migrant women. And how do you recognize a migrant women? Through ethnic and racialized profiling. And and this has led to a very repressive situation that especially harms migrant sex workers because they are the target of the police action. And one significant thing to note here is that despite the fact that the Nordic model is marketed as protective and decriminalizing people who sell sex, this protection does not extend to migrants. So in the Nordic region, the Aliens Act defines sex work as a ground for deportation and denial of entry, even if selling of sex is not a crime. So in other words, there's this bifurcated regulation of national and foreign sex work that's taking place. And as a consequence of this, the foreigners that I talked with feared contact with the police. And the threat of deportation was also the first thing Mary, a Nigerian woman with a residence permit in Spain, started to talk about. Here we have the fear of the police. I have pressure. If you are walking on the streets here, sometimes they control you. Check your ID. Okay, you are from Spain. They say that you have to go to the ticket office to buy a return ticket. You have to go back to where you came from. You have to go back to Spain or Italy or wherever you came from. They will ban that person not to come here for 4 to 5 years. That's the reason why we're afraid. If you have a European passport, citizenship, they're a little bit nicer because most of the people with European passport have a job here. They have finished documents. I'm not like them. They have 2 jobs, work in the street and work in factory. They don't get shocked like me when they see the police. So what we can see is that there is a de facto criminalization of sex sale, even if the Nordic model claims to say that it focuses on the clients or on the sex buyers and not on the sex workers. And what this has led to is also that people are afraid to report crime and exploitation to officials. So for example, if you get robbed, you have to think twice whether you report to the police, thinking about the consequences that you might have. You might be deported from the country, or you might lose your place of residence. So often people said that they wouldn't go to the police if it wasn't about like life and death situation. So what we can see is that the Nordic model actually produces vulnerability for violence, and some criminal groups and clients also abuse this vulnerability. They know that they cannot go to the police. So for example, when I was doing my fieldwork in Norway, there was this group that was robbing sex workers at gunpoint, because sex workers often have a lot of money with them. And they knew that, getting caught is less likely because people don't go to the police. So going to the summary. So we can see that, despite the aim to shift the focus on clients and traffickers, sex workers are still the main target of policing. So the focus hasn't really shifted. And what I argue is that the client investigation actually function more as a smokescreen for repressive practices that lead to evictions and deportations. And another kind of important takeaway is here that the increase in migrants in commercial sex in general has shifted the regulation from prostitution policy to immigration controls. And this has led to racialized policing and bifurcated regulation of nationals and foreigners. So what to think about this? So we can see that there is a tension between this feminist humanitarian kind of ideal and discourse related to the Nordic model and the actual governance focused on the abolition, getting rid of commercial sex. And there are many scholars who have talked about new humanitarianism, Didier Fassin and Miriam Tichting, referring to these kind of mechanisms where marginalized populations are governed in the name of saving and protecting, and that these policies often have unintended or maybe also intended negative consequences. And if we think about the roots of the Nordic model, they are in this kind of radical feminist argumentation of violence against women and protecting women in the sex trade. However, at the same time that the law was passed, Sweden was going through internationalization, the opening of borders, joining the EU. And these kind of like anti-immigrant sentiments and fear of national borders also affected the passing of the law. And we can see this tension between protecting and excluding in the motivations of the legislation materialized in what I call the selective feminism and punitive humanitarianism of the Nordic model. So thinking about the success of the Nordic model, so if we think about the media environment, which is kind of like filled with these images of spectacle, of suffering, of sex trafficking, the Nordic model kind of offers an easy fix to the ethical necessity to act in face of these injustices that we see. And what I have like theorized in my work is that the global success relies in this idea of like Nordic welfare states as providing just solutions to social problems, and also kind of the high profile of gender equality. Another thing that kind of the Nordic model offers this kind of easy fix that, you know, often the reasons why people engage in sex work are due to kind of economic and especially global economic differences. So this kind of offers this criminal, like this solution focused on criminal justice rather than social justice or enhancing the rights of marginalized populations or rethinking about the wealth distributions or migrant rights in the West. So in a way, it has the ability to symbolize benevolence and protection and mask the punitive policies. Mask the punitive policing prevents a discussion of other feminist approaches that would be more not focused on criminal justice system and increasing policing, but for example, enhancing rights and thinking about the wealth distribution. And I think I'll end here. Like I've just published a policy brief where you can find more information or kind of summary of the findings that I presented here. You can find it from the Women, Peace and Security Center website. And it will be translated this year to other languages as well, hoping to have some policy impact. And for the possible discussion, I will just leave these core policy recommendations that I make in the policy brief here. Yes, that's all. Thank you.